So you just downloaded Adobe Lightroom Classic and you're looking at it and it's a bit overwhelming. Well, in today's video, we're gonna break it down for you and go through step by step what each slider does and what each section does, because it can be a little bit overwhelming when you first get into it, but it's really basic and it's really easy and we'll get you started. So the first thing you wanna do is upload your photos to Lightroom. So make sure your SD card is plugged in, and then you come over to the Library tab, you come down to Import, you find wherever your photos are. For me, it's DCIM. And here, all of my photos are already grayed out because I've already uploaded these. But you would see all of your photos here, and then you would just hit import. But before you do that, here's a little tip that'll save you a ton of time. Trust me, I wish I knew about this so much sooner, but it's just one of those things that went over my head, under my radar, whatever you want to say. So just hit Option on your keyboard, and what this does is it clears out all of the videos. You come down here to check videos, uncheck videos. So if you're out shooting and you have a bunch of photos and you have some video on that same SD card, Lightroom is going to want to import all of that into the catalog. But what we want is just the photos. So by holding Option, we can uncheck all of the videos. Now, none of those videos on our SD card are going to import into our Lightroom catalog. So after that, you just hit done. So once your photos are all imported into Lightroom, they all appear here in this Library tab, where you can go through and you can double click and see what your photos look like, and just use your arrow keys to go by and see what the photos look like. So here's just a basic reflection shot. So I can go into Develop, and now we're in the editing process here. Now, right off the bat, there's a couple of things that I would immediately change about this photo. For instance, it's a little off kilter, it looks like. So I can come over here to this crop section, and you can hit auto, and it just aligns the photo a little bit more. This auto section is generally where I start, because a lot of the times my photos are a little off kilter, and I like to start there. So after that, we can come down here to temperature. Now this goes off of white balance. So if you shot it at the wrong white balance, or you have a weird color cast, you can fix it here by just pulling this around. Obviously, we'll bring it all the way up, you get very orange. You bring it all the way down, you get very blue. If you double click the slider, it resets it back to normal. Now, this was a warmer day and it's shot in fall, so all of these colors are really bright and vibrant, and I really want to show that. So I would bring up the warmth just a little bit. Now, tint is where you can really get rid of color casts. So if you have a weird blue haze or a green haze, you can just correct it by just bringing it back and forth. Or you can use this as a creative output to change the vibe of your photo. But in this case, I actually kind of like it here, so I'm not going to change the tint too much. Now this is your exposure. This will change your brightness and your darkness. Now for this photo, it's pretty exposed correctly. The blacks look good, the whites look good. It doesn't look like it's too far off, but I might just raise the exposure just a tiny little bit. Now contrast adds more depth to your photo. Contrast is the difference between brightness, color, shape, all of that between your lightest and darkest parts. As you can see here, if I bring up the contrast, we get a much darker, more dramatic looking image. You bring it back, you get a more faded look. So if you want a more faded film look, you might pull back on the contrast a bit. Now, I'm just going to double click to reset that, and I'm going to add a little bit of contrast. Now, highlights are your lightest parts of your images. So if you have a lot of blown out highlights, like for instance, if there's a light in your scene that is bright white and it's causing this weird sort of glow over your image, you can pull that all the way down, and you'll lose a lot in the sky and the subsurface reflections. Personal preference. Bring it all the way up, you can see that difference. Now, shadows are your darkest parts of your images. So if you have a certain spot in your image that's very, very dark and you want to bring back those details, you can bring your shadows up. So let's zoom in on this photo to a dark spot here. So we have really dark spots here. If I bring up the shadows, you can see the details return. But if I were to go backwards, those dark spots get a hell of a lot darker. Now this is a way that you can add more contrast to your image if that's something you want to do. Your whites and blacks are a bit different than your shadows and your highlights, but kind of do the same thing, but in a more pronounced way. So if I were to bring these all the way up, you can see the sky gets completely blown out. All of the highlights in the photo get really, really strong. And then if I were to bring it all the way down, the photo kind of looks dull. But you can add a little bit more of dramatic look to your photos by bringing up the whites a bit. Makes it a bit more punchy. And the blacks are the same thing. But if you bring down the blacks, you get a deeper sort of moody look. Now, if you come up to the histogram here, you see these two little arrows. If you select those, they'll actually show you your brightest points and your darkest points. So if I were to bring down the blacks, you can see these are absolute black. And if I were to bring up the whites, that's absolute white. Usually I try and avoid this. Now texture and clarity are like sharpening, but kind of on steroids. So if I were to bring the texture all the way down, we get a really blurry image. But you bring it all the way up, you get this really weird sort of sharpening happening to everything. Now, I don't tend to use texture all that much, but I will add clarity, because clarity actually looks pretty nice if you do it a little tiny bit. If I bring it all the way up, we get this weird HDR mess. You bring it all the way down, you get this sort of interesting early 2000s effect, which I don't like. But you bring it up just a little bit and it actually looks pretty nice. It's kind of punchy. Dehaze is really good for if you have overcast skies, or you want to make your sky look more pronounced, or you want to create a dreamy look. So if I bring it down, we get a faded look. If I bring it up, we get a much more saturated look. For a photo like this, it's not really useful. However, if you're shooting on a foggy day and you want to add a little bit dehaze, it'll actually cut through some of that fog. So saturation just really brings out the colors a lot more, but you can really go overboard with it. Like, you wouldn't want a photo that looks like this, and then this is black and white. A good way to think of vibrance is basically saturation for the less prominent colors. So if you were to bring up your saturation all the way, this pretty much affects every color in your photo, but vibrance only affects the less dominant colors. It almost does the same sort of thing, but if you were to bring it all the way down, you can still see that we have some color. It's not just black and white anymore, like it was with saturation. If we bring saturation down, complete black and white, we bring vibrance down, we still retain some color. Now the tone curve is very popular. I tend to not use it as much as I use the sliders. I prefer the sliders, but to each their own. Basically, this is the same sort of deal, but in one step. So you can drag it across the bottom and affect your blacks. You can drag this across the top and affect your whites, and everything in the middle is basically your highlights, your shadows, all that. So a very popular thing to do is add an S curve. So by clicking this line, you can add points to it, and you can just drag them down, drag this up, and that's your very basic S curve. Now you can do the same thing, but only affect certain colors. So this is the red channel, green channel, and blue channel. So you can start to really mess around with your colors and get some really unique looking presets per se. Me, I prefer the color mixer. That's just down here. You have hue, saturation, luminance, and all. So I tend to work off of hue, and I pick whatever colors I really like and I want to change, and just dragging them up and down will change the hue. Now we have lots of orange in this, so I would bring the orange down and around, and you can see how it's really changing it. So if I were to bring it up, everything kind of looks the same. We get more colors if we drag it down. It really starts to separate all of those trees. So I actually like that look. Now, if I were to enhance it, I can come over to saturation, and I can bring up the saturation of just those colors. And luminance really makes those pop. So if I were to drag it all the way up, it almost adds highlights to these colors, but I don't like that. But if I were to bring it down, it really darkens those colors and it looks terrible. So use luminance with discretion. So if I were to bring it up a little bit more, kind of makes those colors stand out and adds almost a little bit of depth to the photo. So here is color grading. You have these three little circles And these represent your shadows, your midtones, and your highlights. So if you really want to get unique looks, you can start dragging these around and you can see how the color changes. Now this is affecting our darkest parts and this is affecting our lightest parts. And the midtones will affect everything in between. So a really popular thing to do is an orange and teal look. So you can bring it down teal or this way, do reverse. So kind of like there. I'm going to drag down the intensity to about here. And then I can do the same thing to the highlights. I kind of like the look of the water there, but I'm going to drag it down and make it less apparent. And your midtones, you can decide where you want that color to go. So I'm actually going to bring it up a little bit to here. Now look, if you hit backslash on your keyboard, you can see all the changes you've made. So this photo already looks super punchy compared to the raw file. Now you can use these sliders at the bottom here to your own discretion to add a little bit more punch to the photo. But I actually like them zeroed out. Blending and balance just helps you dial in that preset that you've made. So you can bring it up, down, and it doesn't affect it too much, but you can mess around with those sliders and really dial in that look that you're going for. Now here in the detail panel, we can add sharpening. So right now Lightroom already has some sharpening, but it's applied it to the entire photo. What I generally like to do is I like to hold Option and drag up the slider. So you can see all of that white, that's the sharpening being applied just to those parts of the image. Now I generally like to bring up the mask so it's only affecting the edges. So instead of applying sharpening to the entire image, now it's only applying it to the edges. Lightroom's denoise feature is honestly fantastic. However, you can only use it on your raw photos. It won't work with JPEG. But if you click it, it'll just take a second to load, but it'll show here that it's denoising the image. Now you can bring it all the way up, but it'll give you a kind of painterly look. But if you bring it all the way to the bottom, you're not doing anything at all. So I usually hover around 30%, but on a photo like this, I shot it at ISO 100, so there's practically no noise in the photo. But in low light scenarios where, you know, you're shooting in the evening or sunrise and you have to bump up your ISO quite a bit and you start introducing all that grain and noise, well, this is a great way to minimize that. After that, it'll create a DNG file of your photo that's denoised. Now it's up to you if you want to do this at the start of your editing process or at the end of your editing process. Generally, if I have a really noisy photo, I'll start with the denoise feature first and then edit off of that. Otherwise, if you edit your photo and you forget about denoise, you can just add it at the end. Honestly, I haven't really seen too much of a difference, to be honest. So now we're in lens corrections. Now you have profile. Basically, this is choosing the profile of your lens and your camera. And Lightroom does a pretty good job of recognizing what camera and what lens you've used. So this is already default. I didn't touch any of this. This is just Lightroom. And it's already removed chromatic aberration and it's added profile corrections. And basically what that does is if your lens has quite a big distortion on it, the things in the bottom of the image or the top of the image look a little bit warped, it automatically corrects that. And for chromatic aberration, that's basically the light fringe on certain subjects. So a lot of the times with lower quality lenses, when you take a photo that's very well lit or backlit, you'll generally get a blue hue and a red hue on either side of a branch, a person. This basically removes that, but it does an okay job, but on lower quality lenses, you might still notice it. And then if you come over to manual, you can start to mess around with that a bit more and really kind of dial in that look of getting rid of those things. So for example, if I drag up or down, you can see the image warp. That's basically just correcting the lens's flaw pretty much. But I shot this on a 70-200 f2.8L, which is a professional lens. So generally I don't notice a ton of fringing on my photos or chromatic aberrations. So I generally don't have to fix it. Now, vignetting is basically when you start to see in the corners of your image start to get dark. Well, that's a vignette. And you can correct that by just dragging this slider around. Obviously, if I bring it down here, it adds a vignette. If I bring it up here, it adds a white vignette. This photo has no vignetting on it, so I don't need to correct it. Now the transform tab basically warps your image in certain ways. It's generally helpful if you're shooting a building and it starts to go up like this in a kind of diagonal way. You can change that by transforming the horizontal or the vertical and pull it back so it's straight. So in this sense, if I drag here, it stretches. If I drag down, it stretches the opposite way. That's really good for buildings. Same with the horizontal. You can rotate the image, aspect, squish the image, scale, offset, Y offset. In most cases, you won't really have to transform your images at all. I generally never use this unless I'm shooting architecture where I want to get those lines that my lens have warped. I want to get those lines straight again. That's when I would dive into this section. Lens blur is a new feature. I generally don't use it, but you know, if you're shooting subjects and you want to separate them from the background and add some bokeh, you can do that. Honestly, it's just a feature that's in there that I generally don't really use all that often, but I can see it definitely being helpful for portrait photographers. Effects, this is basically vignette. You can add a white vignette, a dark vignette. If you shot a digital photo and you want to make it look more like film, you can add grain, bring this size up, change the grain around, roughness, make it look like it was shot in the 1800s. I'm not going to do any of that because I like my photos to look very clean and crisp unless I am shooting on film or going for a stylistic approach, which generally I don't do, but I can definitely see that this feature being very helpful to some people. And last but not least is the calibration tab. You can get some really unique colors out of this. You can almost just edit your entire photo off of this. Basically every camera has their own color profile put in, and this you can change that and tweak it around a little bit. So you can change the hue, you can change the green hue, change the red hue, add tint, and you have saturation. But if we just pull these sliders around just a little bit, we can get some really unique looking photos out of this. Let's just hit backslash on the keyboard and see where we've started. So that's the raw, and that's what we've done so far. Now, if you come over the crop section, you can change all of your different aspect ratios and do custom, as shot, original, 4x5, that's Instagram. You can change your angle, fix your horizon, hit auto, that auto corrects it, and then you just click back and then that applies it. I don't like that, so I'm just gonna come back here and hit as shot, click out of it, and we're back to normal. Now you come over here to this little eraser tab, and you can basically use this section just to heal imperfections in your photo if you have lens spots or you have something that you want to remove. In this case, I have some branches and stuff here that I feel detract from the photo that I'm going to remove. However, I will remove those in Photoshop as opposed to Lightroom, just because Photoshop does a better job. Come over here to this eyeball. This is to fix, you know, that color cast in people's eyes. So a lot of the times if you use a flash, you'll get people with red eyes. You can use that to fix it. Same with your pet's eyes. Generally, don't have to use it, but I can see that it's useful. So you come over here to this little circle. This is your mask section. So here you can selectively change the colors and the contrast in certain parts of your image. Whether you have a subject, this will automatically detect people or things in your photo. In this photo in particular, there's no real subject to select. So if I were to select this, it might just select, yeah, it did nothing. The sky selection automatically makes a selection of just the sky. So now you can see that it's kind of pink up here. That means the sky is just selected. So if I were to bring the exposure down or all the way up, you can see that it only affects the sky. Now you can see you can change all of these features and it'll only apply it to that mask. Now a cool thing you can do is if you want to select the entire image except for the sky, you can click this mask icon, right click, and just hit invert mask. Now everything except for the sky is selected. So you can make your changes here, and it'll only affect this part of the image. So I'm just going to click this mask and hit delete. Now we have other masks here like sky, background, people, objects, brush, linear gradient, radial gradient, color range, luminance. So these all are very handy to have. I generally like to use linear gradients and radial gradients. A lot of times for the sky, I will just use a radial gradient because I like the fall off over the horizon. Now, when would we generally use these? Well, I like to create my own vignettes on my photos, so I pulled one down across the sky here, and I'm just going to darken it a little bit. Then I'm going to come over here, add a linear gradient, bring one up from the side, darken that a bit, Command C, Command V. I've copied and pasted that new mask, and now I've basically made my own vignette that's drawing your eye to the center of the photo. Now you can grab the radial gradient, just select the middle. That's my subject here. I can drag a little bit of exposure to make that subject a bit brighter. Now, if I wanted to paint in certain things, I can come over to the brush tab. You have size, feather, flow density. Now, auto mask will try its best to kind of select only what you want it to select. It works sometimes, it's handy. So if I were to zoom in here, and let's just say I wanted to paint in just some of this brush. So I can bring my size down, have auto mask selected, and then I can just paint in this section. And auto mask will do its best to try and only paint in what it thinks I'm trying to paint in. So now that that's selected, I can change these things around. You can see how it's affecting just that. If I were to undo auto mask and try it again, you can see that it would go over and it kind of looks messy. Now your feather is how harsh it is. So if I bring this feather all the way down where there's no feather at all and just paint across, it's like I'm just painting willy-nilly. But if I bring it all the way up, it'll kind of fade off to the edges, as you can see here. Now we have color range and luminance range. Now these get a little bit more intensive. I generally don't use them myself, but they are very handy to have. All right, and that's the basics of Lightroom. Now you can get way more in depth, but this is basically the bare bones breakdown of Lightroom. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, subscribe. I'd love to see you guys back here hanging out in another video. All right, you guys have a great day. Peace.